Hi everyone, welcome to our session, everything you wanted to know about Kubernetes but were afraid to ask. My name's Rob Knight and I'm Souza's CTO of Enterprise Cloud Products, and with me I have
Peter Andersson, and I'm an application developer technical strategist at Souza.
It's great to have everyone here today. We're going to do a bit of a different type of session today rather than perhaps pitch a product or do a demo. Peter's going to play the role of our developer because at Souza we get a lot of questions from developer, and I think Peter, you've been working with them quite closely for a number of years now.
6 years maybe.
Exactly. And so Peter's going to ask many of the common questions which he encounters in the field around the world of Kubernetes. But please do ask questions. That's the whole point of this session, really, is to ask questions. We do have a section at the end for them. Oh, hello, we have another person.
Yeah, hello. I'm the host of this room, Raymond.
Oh, hi.
Hi,
My
Raymond.
computer crashed, so I was waiting for everybody to join, for you to be there. And now I'm here. Sorry.
Okay.
I was in the wrong room, it appears. So sorry, but you already got started, right?
Yes, I hit the record button, which I think I wasn't sure if I should do, but I hit it.
Great. All right, I'll leave you to it.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
Yeah, so as I was saying, please do ask questions throughout. There's points where we can kind of break off and go to questions, and it saves us kind of just talking and answering the questions which we've already decided in advance. So first off, Peter.
Yeah, so the first question is, who is Souza?
Yeah, so who is Souza? Well, so I'm sure some of you have heard about us before. We are one of the biggest open source vendors in the market. We've been around for more than 28 years now. Traditionally best known for our operating system, our Linux operating system, SLES. But as times have moved on, we've branched out into all realms across the software-defined infrastructure. And with the recent successful acquisition of Rancher Labs, now a major player in the Kubernetes management space. Everything we do at Souza is open source, and everything that we do is out and in the open. And although we may at some point later today talk about some of our products that we have, everything that we do is also available as an open source project. There's no complex licensing models such as SSPL out there. You can go and run our code as an individual in the same way that a large organization can. So does that answer the question, Peter?
Yep, that's what I wanted to know. So the second question is, what is Kubernetes? It seems to be a lot of in the industry talking about Kubernetes, so I'm very curious. What is it?
Yes, I mean, everyone's talking about Kubernetes because it really is an exciting and transformative piece of technology. So as I'm sure many of you know or saw sessions about earlier in the event yesterday, containers can be a great way to package up software and applications. But on their own, they don't really fulfill all of the needs that we have when running containers in production. And Kubernetes is really an infrastructure tool that addresses those gaps that just running Docker on its own has. So it deals with things like software-defined networking, how we handle security in production, how do we handle high availability. I like to, if I were to say it in a sentence, Kubernetes ensures that the right container is running in the right place at the right time and has all of the services that it needs behind it. So as a kind of a very brief overview, does that help, Peter?
Yeah, as an overview. There are some questions also in the chat window. Can you see them?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I can.
So I think you partly answered William's question, and while we dig into the questions later on, we will talk more into microservices and so on. So we will hold that question for a little bit while.
Yes.
And also Alexandra had a question about building Kubernetes cluster and our recommendations, and I think we should save that maybe to the end.
Yep,
You
we'll
think
park
that's a good
that
idea?
to the
All
end.
right.
Yeah.
So, so we start a little bit scratching the surface of Kubernetes, and you mentioned Docker. How does this relate to Docker, Kubernetes, and Docker? What's the relationship?
So the relationship really is that Kubernetes allows us to run the containers that we've built with Docker. Docker is a container engine on its own, but it's also a wider suite of developer tooling as well, such as Docker Desktop, which I'm sure many of you have come across. But with the exception of Docker Swarm, it doesn't really have the components that we need when running Kubernetes in production at scale that I talked about earlier on. And I heard you also mention as well kind of what kind of parts are in there and how does it relate. And I think this diagram summarizes it quite well. When we look at the very high level overview of what a Kubernetes cluster is, it's a set of master nodes, which is running our Kubernetes control plane, and they do run a series of components. There's also a database, a backing store, where we store the state of our Kubernetes cluster. And then there's a series of worker nodes as well, which is where our ultimate workloads end up running. But when we contrast that to Docker, which is something that as a developer, you didn't install on your laptop and then run to start packaging apps, I think it's quite a different architecture.
Okay, but could we dig a little bit more into Kubernetes? What components are there inside, and how does it all fit together?
Yes, I think that's also represented on the slide here as well. I think we could do an hour-long session about the individual components.
Okay.
But inside of that control plane, there's a series of components like Kube Controller Manager, for example. We also have elements like the kubelet. But I think for people who want to learn more, if they at the end of the session, we've got some links where they can learn more and follow through on that. But I think we'll keep it quite high level for this session, Peter.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I've also heard a lot of people talking about pods. What is a pod, Rob?
Yes, so, and I've got a slide on this as well. A pod is the smallest unit of deployment in the Kubernetes world. It allows us to group one or more closely coupled containers. A pod, for example, can share storage. It also shares its own network namespace as well. And I mentioned worker nodes on the previous question. Pods are ultimately what we end up scheduling down to individual worker nodes. And I think when it comes to how we would describe a pod or how we'd push a pod on the screen now, I'm showing the YAML which we could write to push to Kubernetes to get that up there. We can see at the very top we're describing it's a type, it's a pod, and further down we give it a name. We describe what image that we're running and what container ports that we want published. It really is kind of the smallest unit of execution in the Kubernetes world.
Okay. So pods are created, but how are they distributed to my customers?
Yes, so I think when it comes to how pods are scheduled, that's really what the control plane is for. It's the Kubernetes control plane will schedule individual pods down to worker nodes. But if you're producing software that is to be packaged in containers and shipped to your own individual customers, then you'd usually look to package those up in Helm charts, for example, which is kind of like a package manager for Kubernetes, and you can bundle all of the different components your app needs into a single Helm chart and then distribute that to your customers.
So Helm is a little bit like RPM in the Linux world.
Yes, yeah, that's a good analogy. Yeah.
Okay, good, thanks. And I've also heard a lot about deployments. What is that?
Yeah, so deployment is yet another type of object that we can deploy with Kubernetes, and it's really a way for us to manage individual groups of pods at scale. So we can manage them as a group, for example, in terms of scaling up or scaling down. And Kubernetes really, it's always trying to ensure that the state of our cluster matches the desired state that we've told it that we want our cluster to look like. For example, if we've already got running inside of a deployment 2 pods, and then we tell Kubernetes we want a third one launched, it will notice that the cluster is now out of sync, and then the controllers will ensure that a new pod is launched to then bring that up to 3. And as with the pod example, we've got an example of a deployment here as well. This is one for a very simple Nginx deployment. I'd recommend to people, because of the value that the deployment resource can give us, we shouldn't really be working with individual pods. I think if you want to deploy something, wrap it inside of a deployment, because it gives us a number of benefits, as I mentioned just now.
Okay, thanks. And what is a service?
So yeah, when it comes to services, this is kind of how we manage networking in the Kubernetes world. And if we look at the overview of a service, it's how we can expose an application that's running behind a set of pods. Services have their own IP addresses and they have their own DNS records for service discovery. And if you've got one app and you need it to talk to another component of the same app, you can use a service to handle that. And because the service sits in front of all of the pods as a group, it will always ensure that traffic is routed to an available instance of that pod. And I think here's a kind of a graphical representation of that. You know, we can talk to a service and then it will redirect that traffic down to one of our pods, which is running inside of a deployment. When it comes to what that looks like in YAML terms, again, very, very simple example given on the screen now. Now, did I see a question pop through?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions. William had a very good question about how could you give a concrete example of orchestration? But we will come to that a little bit later as well.
Yeah, I think when it comes to giving an example like the one you see on the screen now of a more complex app, that kind of goes beyond a 30-minute introductory session we've got, but we've got some follow-on links which you can follow that can walk you through tutorials and that can cover all of those aspects in their entirety. I think Alexandra may have posted a question. Peter?
Yeah, do you recommend redeveloping existing applications to fit the microservices model of Kubernetes?
So that is a very interesting question. Do we recommend redeveloping existing apps? I think it all depends on the potential value that you can get out of redeveloping that app and hosting it on Kubernetes. To give an example, I talk to customers all the time who are considering doing exactly that, looking at their app estate and thinking, do we need to redevelop it or re-platform it to run on top of Kubernetes? Now, if their app has been stable, been running for a number of years and perhaps doesn't see very frequent changes, then perhaps not, because the work of doing so can often outweigh the actual benefits that you'd get at the end of the day by doing so. But if perhaps it's going as part of a larger refactor piece or as part of an overall organizational kind of push towards cloud native and microservices, then it's definitely something worth considering. But it really is done on a case by case basis. I would never say to everyone you should replatform all of your apps to run on top of Kubernetes, because although yes, that can make people like Souza a lot of money in doing so, it may not necessarily get you a lot of value at the end of the day.
Yeah, but maybe if you take a monolithic application and do it in small chunks, maybe add a new feature to it and add that as a microservice and keep a big piece of the software.
Exactly, yeah, that definitely is one route. And yeah, starting small, I would always advise starting small, especially if you're just getting started out with these technologies.
Yeah, Naresh had a very good question. What about the best way to implement disaster recovery in Kubernetes?
Yes, so in terms of disaster recovery, there's multiple tools out there that can back up the state of your Kubernetes cluster, and then restore that into a new Kubernetes cluster when you provision it? The answer to this really depends on what cloud you're running on and what Kubernetes distribution or platforms you're using underneath. I personally always feel that if you can ensure that you have the CI, CD, and GitOps tooling in place to rapidly be able to deploy to any cluster, then if something dramatically goes wrong, you can just point that tooling at a different endpoint. Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope. Rancher provides some tools to help that and make that easier.
Yeah, we do, and I think that's actually a kind of an interesting point to come to, Peter. So you mentioned Rancher just now. I'm sure some of the people may not have heard of Rancher. So I think we should come to actually, yeah, what is Rancher? And I think my screenshots stopped sharing, so I'll bring back my screen share because we do have a slide on that. So when we say Rancher, there could be a few different toolings that we mean. Rancher is a Kubernetes management tool. It allows us to give a web UI and CLI into multiple different Kubernetes clusters. It's a tool to deploy Kubernetes clusters, and it's a tool to manage Kubernetes clusters as well. I think it's fair to say at this point that Kubernetes distributions are largely commoditized. There's not necessarily one that has a huge value over the other. The value really is in Kubernetes management. It's in how we bring centralized security to all of those clusters, how we bring centralized authentication to all of those clusters. So for example, if you've got a cluster running in EKS and you've got a local on-prem cluster running RKE, which is one of our Kubernetes distributions, it's about us bringing centralized authentication to that. So your developers can log in using Okta to both clusters, wherever they're running. And this is really one of the benefits of Rancher itself. We don't care where your Kubernetes clusters are running. They could be running on any cloud, on-premise, or even on small edge environments. The way that they are managed is the same. And Rancher acts as a proxy to all of those downstream clusters. And to kind of give a graphical example of what that looks like, we can have our Rancher management framework at the top acting to any downstream cluster, wherever that's running. And I think I saw a couple of questions pop in.
That's what I'm thinking of when I saw that picture. Maybe we should come back to the question about, could you give a concrete example of orchestration? And also another question which also related, would you recommend building one big Kubernetes cluster with many nodes or multiple clusters with less nodes?
So it does, I think, really depend on the use case again and what workloads you're running on top. I'm a huge fan of building multiple clusters and breaking them down into smaller units, purely because things do go wrong. Even in the Kubernetes world, things can still go wrong. And so you don't want to lose huge parts of your infrastructure in one go. And also by breaking things down into smaller clusters, you can then choose what platform is best for the eventual workloads that are being deployed on top of them. And it means that you're not necessarily tied into one specific cloud or one specific vendor. Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
No. When I was at KubeCon 2 years ago, a very common speech there was, okay, my cluster is gone. What do I do now? And very often the answer was, yeah, but I have 3 other clusters where everything is working on, and just focus on the one that is broken and rebuild it from the beginning.
Exactly, yeah. If you've got it in multiple smaller ones, if it breaks, it becomes a lot easier to then scale up one of the existing clusters, again, repointing the CI to that other environment and redeploying the workloads. Yeah, I agree.
We got one question. Does Kubernetes handle deployment plus container configuration in one place?
Yeah, so it absolutely can. There's a specific Kubernetes resource, the config map, and you can store the configuration for your applications inside of that. And there are also, third-party toolings that can help assist with that as well. But yeah, config maps is one place you can store container configuration.
And here is a tricky one, I would think, from Jonah. What are the specs of your cluster you should watch with growing use of the cluster and more pods in the cluster?
Yes, so I mean, scaling can be a huge topic in its own right.
Exactly.
One of the common metrics that's often forgotten is available pods per node. So most distributions have a limit of the number of pods they can run on each node. Sometimes it's just over 100, sometimes it's 250, and that can easily be exhausted. So long before RAM or CPU on the nodes is exhausted, number of pods can run out. So that's definitely one area to look for. Obviously, of course, the traditional metrics of CPU and RAM use are applicable here as well.
IO,
I think
very important.
exactly. IO, yeah.
Especially etcd is very sensitive to high latency, if I
Exactly,
understand
yeah.
correctly.
And as you deploy more and more workloads to your cluster, the control plane is gonna, get more and more resource intensive, and etcd can be very heavy on IO.
Yeah, here is another very interesting question. When would you recommend to use Kubernetes over Cloud Foundry?
Yeah, so that is a huge question in its own right. So I think, Peter, you've spent a lot of time dealing with developers who have used both. What would be your feedback on that question?
I would say that they are solving different problems, actually. So they are not comparable. Kubernetes is a cloud platform, a container platform, and the Cloud Foundry is a platform as a service. So actually, you can run a Cloud Foundry on top of Kubernetes if you want to.
Yeah, you definitely can, and I think a lot of the times what I've witnessed in companies is they're building their own custom paths on top of Kubernetes. They're using their own CI/CD. They're spending a lot of time building that custom paths as well. I think Kubernetes provides the most flexibility, and especially if it comes to dealing with legacy apps and perhaps lifting and shifting those into Kubernetes. It's much more flexible than Cloud Foundry. However, for developers, the Cloud Foundry experience is really good, right? It's super simple, and I know a lot of people that are using it at scale still to this day. There are a couple of projects out there to bring that experience on top of Kubernetes, and I've actually got a slide which mentions one of those in terms of how we're approaching things at Souza. We recently launched the Souza-projects.github.io page, which lists all of the open source projects that we at Souza produce. A couple of ones of note, Rancher Desktop, and that's all about bringing the Kubernetes experience down to the desktop. So if you've used Docker Desktop before to develop apps on top of Kubernetes, there's a couple of pain points. For example, you can't choose the version of Kubernetes that you're using. You're stuck with the version that it brings you. And although this is very early alpha state, Rancher Desktop allows you to choose any version and brings with it some other benefits as well, so it's worth checking out. And Opinio is the other one that I mentioned because it relates to that previous question from Remco, and that is all about bringing a simplified developer experience to Kubernetes as well. Again, it's relatively early days. We've recently started innovating on this, but it brings a lot of the concepts that were in the Cloud Foundry world, plus the experience that we at Souza have had in the Cloud Foundry world over a few years of producing a Cloud Foundry product into the world of Kubernetes. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you have time.
Cool. Yeah, Navid, I hope you pronounce your name right. Did you have a good question? Does Kubernetes have any distinct advantages over Docker Swarm for relatively simple setups?
So I think the key there is in the phrase for relatively simple setups. And I think this is definitely an area where Docker Swarm, has its benefits. But I wouldn't rule out Kubernetes just because you've got a relatively simple setup. There are still benefits that can be brought, to it. It is massively scalable. It's also future-proofing you. There aren't new tools being made that are, kind of working in the Docker Swarm or even the Docker Compose world, especially from independent software vendors. They're packaging their products now out in Helm charts or to be deployed on top of Kubernetes. But if you do have a simple setup, I would like to highlight K3S to you as well. If you've not heard of it before, K3S is a lightweight Kubernetes distribution, initially started by Rancher, but it has now been donated to the CNCF, or rather accepted into the incubator project, I believe. And it allows you to run Kubernetes in a single binary. It removes the biggest kind of heavyweight part of Kubernetes, which is etcd, what Peter was talking about earlier, and replaces it with a SQLite database or a number of other different data backends. It is pluggable. So if you have a simple environment or a smaller environment and you're looking for a way to get started with Kubernetes a bit easier than some of the traditional distributions, K3S is definitely something that I'd say to look into.
Okay, cool. Something that is talked a lot about in this world is 12-factor app. Can you describe that a little bit? It also connects a little bit to microservices question earlier.
Yes, so the 12-factor app originally promoted by the Heroku team. 12 development ideas. It's an architecture really for designing an app and an architecture for building microservices. I think the idea was if you build your application using the 12-factor methodology, that it can be more portable, it can be more scalable, and it can ultimately be run as a software as a service application. I think that's really where the initial target mind was. I think these days, the world of microservices has evolved a bit beyond the traditional 12 factors. I've heard phrases like the 18-factor app thrown around, or the 25 factor thrown around even. But if you do build containers and you do embrace all of those 12 factors, then getting them up and running on Kubernetes should be a much less painful path than how we used to build things before. I hope that answers the question, Peter.
Yeah, but also when I read pieces of it, I can see that apps should be stateless, but I need to store data in my apps. How does that work?
Yeah, so I think the idea here really is that the application process itself is stateless. It's not necessarily writing things out to the local file system. The idea is if it needs to store data or store state, it stores that in an external storage system. Now, in the world of Kubernetes, we can accomplish this through what seems quite complex at first, but can be broken down a lot easier through persistent volumes. There's also storage classes for automatic storage provisioning. So the idea here is that you don't store the state in the app itself, you store it in an external data source, because there could be hundreds of instances of your app running. So they need to be able to talk to the same set of data or same set of state date.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, I got another good question from Naresh. Rancher is open source tools? Question mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And one more, how does Rancher, how more how this Rancher will manage multi-cloud Kubernetes clusters?
Now, that is a great question. Yep, Rancher is completely open source software. All our customers pay for is support if they want enterprise support, or occasionally if they want consulting or professional services as well. You can download the binaries and get started today. And in terms of how it can help manage multi-cloud Kubernetes clusters, conveniently enough, because of one of the other questions that Peter was going to ask, I do happen to have a Rancher environment available to me now. This is the Rancher Cluster Explorer dashboard. This is how we manage our workloads, and you can see their deployments are listed there. Pods are listed there that we talked about earlier on. But when it comes to managing multi-cloud Kubernetes clusters, that can be super easy. So we see I've got my local cluster that I've got deployed here. If I wanted to deploy a new cluster, I just click Add Cluster. I kind of choose where my Kubernetes cluster is going to be deployed, and then this will connect off to the cloud provider to go and deploy that Kubernetes cluster. If you've got an existing Kubernetes cluster, well, then that's even simpler. We can simply import the cluster by running, normally it's one line of YAML through our kubectl, and then that will import the cluster and it will appear in our list of clusters, and we get all of the management capabilities that we had with Rancher deployed clusters for those when it comes to app management. I hope that answers the question, Peter.
Yeah. But Rancher, if I want to try it out, is it just go download it, and will it be the same thing as if I want support, or is it different versions?
Exactly the same binaries. There's no difference at all. You can just head to rancher.com today and follow the instructions. And I have a link at the end as well that we're going to show with a QR code you can scan to find out more information on that as well. So I think, Peter, we've covered all of the kind of the headline topics we wanted to talk about, and there's been some great questions that have come through. Before we finish up for the day, I'm going to invite people to ask any more questions that they've got through the chat or the question tool. And while we wait for those to come in, I'm going to share my screen for the final time, because I want to invite everyone to become a part of the Souza developer community. And you can access that by going to community.souza.com and then signing up and creating an account. And this community is kind of, it's different from the communities that Souza's had in the past, in that we're running loads of workshops, loads of tutorials, there's loads of demos that are available in there, and loads of events that you can join completely for free, and then learn a lot about this world of Kubernetes, microservices, and containers. I think it's a great place to go for people just getting started out. But even more than that, it's a social networking platform as well. So it allows you to engage with all of the other members that are on the site, and kind of help build that community spirit and get help from people, not just from Souza, but from other members as well. I'd also invite people to scan the QR code as well that we've got. That is our Kubernetes Management for Dummies free ebook that's there. It's completely free. You just have to click the link or scan the QR code, pop in your details and your email address, and then that will get sent through to you straight away.
Wow. So you mentioned a lot of cool technologies, and but do you have any recommended learning path?
So yeah, from what I personally say is the Rancher Training Academy is a great place to start. Rancher.com, and go through the training section. There's loads of free resources out there that you can get started. inside our events section, as well on rancher.com, as well as on the community.souza.com platform. We'll also be running what we call the Rancher Rodeos, and these again are free interactive e-learning sessions that you can join and can take you from the basics of building your first container through to deploying your first app on top of Kubernetes as well. But outside of the Souza and Rancher world, I think, and you may agree with me, Peter, because you've done it before, but the CKA training and certification, I think, is a really good resource if you're able to go and take it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it takes a lot of time and effort, but it really builds the foundation of how the technology works and how it all is tied together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's can be really helpful when developing on top of Kubernetes. I think there's a final question that slipped in there around: is there an affordable way to run a database cluster, one master, write, multiple slaves, read only with Kubernetes or K3S? And I'd say the answer is yes. There's no reason why not. It all depends on what hardware you've got available. So I think affordable is maybe the bit that I'm unsure of in there, but you absolutely can run that, whether that's I think Postgres is probably the best example to give for that type of database, where you can run that in Kubernetes with that architecture you've described.
Yeah, and K3S is also free if you want to download and test it.
Absolutely, yeah, and it can run on devices that are much smaller than your traditional Kubernetes nodes, such as Intel NUCs or even Raspberry Pis. I think there's a lot of people using them using it on Raspberry Pis.
Yeah, I hope we answered your question, Van Evik, because when you say affordable, not sure what you mean. Is it hardware or is it that you pay for software? That's I'm not sure what you mean there. So if we answered your question, please let us know.
Yep. Or alternatively, reach out to us. I think if you scan the QR code and fill in the details, there'll be an email address which you can email through any questions to that you have. Alternatively, to myself, rob.knight@souza.com. That's Knight with a K, or just search Rob Knight on LinkedIn, and I'm sure I'll pop up at the top. And I'm always happy to answer questions. I think we've got a few seconds left to go. There's a final question in there. You mentioned multiple instances of a service redundancy that share the same externally stored state. Does Kubernetes provide mechanisms or patterns to keep the state consistent? If I'm understanding the question correctly, if the state is stored externally, and obviously your app is accessing that state, it would still be up to the individual application to maintain that state. I'm not aware personally of anything within Kubernetes that can automatically help manage that state. But what Kubernetes will ensure is that the storage is mounted cleanly. If the storage is backed by something that can't be written to by multiple users at once, that it isn't mounted in such a way, and things like that. But I'm not entirely sure I fully understand the question. But I am aware that we're now at the end of our session. So I'd like to thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Peter.
That's exactly correct. Thank you both. Hello, Raymond here, the host. So thanks, Rob and Peter. I can assure that you are the dream of every conference host. Completely self-sufficient. I didn't need to do anything, and you answered all the questions from the chat. So this is a dream come true. So thanks, thank you guys for hosting this live Q&A that you did. And I think the title of your session described exactly right. Everything you wanted to know about Kubernetes, but were afraid to ask. Well, people were not afraid to ask, so
that's good.
I'm happy that they maybe it was the anonymity that you have in the chat instead of asking it to your colleague developer, right, or your colleague next to you. So thanks for this calm way of explaining, and it was really insightful. For all the visitors that enjoyed this session, make sure to rate the session for Rob and Peter and leave feedback for them so that they, for the next time, and also leave feedback about the conference. Rob and Peter, was a pleasure having you. I hope you enjoyed the session as well. And well, this is the final session of today of TEQnation. But don't be sad, because we'll be back tomorrow with our final sessions. So feel free to join again in the afternoon for multiple sessions, workshops, and keynotes. Thanks all for joining, and I wish you a nice evening all. Thanks, Rob and Peter.
Thank you.